Good morning. My name is Tori Gorman. I am the Policy Director for the Concord Coalition. We welcome you here this morning. I am the moderator for today's panel discussion. I'm joined today by three very distinguished researchers to hear their thoughts on Global Aging Authority Richard Jackson's latest paper entitled The Case for Longer Work Lives. As we all know, the graying of America has had a profound effect on our economy and the size and shape of our federal budget, and potentially even our place in the world order. Policy responses to this challenge often involve painful trade-offs between higher taxes and lower benefits. And today we'd like to talk about a third option, which is extending the work lives of aging Americans. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but we're going to try something new with this webinar. And I'd like to start us off with a poll. So Tyler, if you're hearing, you could see the poll there on your screen. We encourage you to record your answers. That poll will probably be up for about a minute, so you should record your answers now. And while you're recording your answers, I'm going to introduce our panel. So today we're joined by Richard Jackson. He is the president and founder of the Global Aging Institute and is an internationally recognized authority on global aging. Prior to launching GAI, Richard directed a research program on global aging at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he is the author or co-author of numerous policy studies on the global aging challenge, including topics like voluntary pensions in emerging markets, new strategies for meeting the retirement security challenge, and from challenge to opportunity, wave 2 of the East Asia Retirement Survey, and lessons from abroad for the US entitlement debate. We're also joined by Jean Sterling. Jean is the Richard B. Fisher Chair and a fellow at the Urban Institute. Among his many distinguished positions, Jean was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the US Department of Treasury for Tax Analysis during the Reagan administration. He was president of the National Tax Association and co-director of the Urban Brookings Joint Tax Policy Center, as well as chair of the 1999 technical panel advising the Social Security Administration on its methods and assumptions. He serves or has served on advisory panels or boards for the Congressional Budget Office, the Government Accountability Office, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and more. He is the author or co-editor of 18 books, including Dead Men Ruling, Nonprofits in Government, Contemporary U.S. Tax Policy, and Advancing the Power of Economic Evidence to Inform Investments in Children, Youth, and Families. Lastly, we're joined by Jason Fichtner. Jason is a fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and he's also a senior lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His research focuses on Social Security, federal tax policy, federal budget policy, retirement security, and policy proposals to increase saving and investment. Previously, he was a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at the George Mason University. He has significant government experience, having served in several positions at the Social Security Administration, including acting deputy commissioner of Social Security, chief economist, and associate commissioner for retirement policy. He also served as senior economist with the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress and as an economist with the Internal Revenue Service. So with that, welcome, gentlemen. Good morning. For our viewers, the format this morning will follow something like this. Richard will start us off with some opening comments. Then I'll pass the microphone to Jean and then to Jason for their discussion points. Around 10:40, 10:45, I will open up the Q&A session, starting with some questions submitted by our registrants. The chat function has been disabled, but if you would like to submit a question for our panel, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So, interesting poll results there real quick. At what age do you plan on retiring? Multiple choices. The big winner, somewhere before age 70. And lots of people never planning to retire. Very interesting. All right, with that, Richard, I'd like to hand the floor to you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Tori. Yeah, as you said, most of the policy responses to the aging of America do seem to involve difficult and painful trade-offs between higher taxes and lower benefits. And while such trade-offs will undoubtedly be necessary, there is another response that could greatly mitigate the need for either. And what we're talking about, of course, is longer work lives. Longer work lives is a response to America's aging challenge. It's both a natural and a necessary response. It's natural because over the course of the post-war era, since today's retirement institutions first took shape, lifespans and health spans have both risen dramatically. Back in 1950, a 65-year-old had a 1 in 4 chance of living to 85. Today, a 65-year-old has a 1 in 2 chance of living to 85. On average, Americans today spend about the last third of their adult lives in retirement. So it's a natural response. It's also a necessary response because the demographic and economic circumstances that made universal early retirement affordable, rapid growth in the working age population and rapid wage growth, simply no longer pertain today. Shifts in demographics and shifts in the economy are rendering these institutions increasingly unsustainable. Now, longer work lives would have substantial benefits. First of all, on the economic front, they could very significantly offset the demographic drag on economic growth. Between 1965 and 1985, when baby boomers were entering the workforce en masse, US employment growth averaged, I believe, 2.2% per year. Since 1985, growth has decelerated as smaller cohorts born after the baby boom have climbed the age ladder. Since 2000, employment growth, and employment growth, of course, is one of the 2 components of GDP growth, employment growth has averaged 0.7%. And looking ahead to the coming decades, even after the economy fully recovers from its COVID-induced coma, we're looking at employment growth of close to 0. And that could easily pull down GDP growth to between 1 and 1.5% per year, which is between a third and 1/2 of its post-war average. We calculate that if adults aged 55 to 74, after adjusting for the higher incidence of disability and inability to work at older ages, were to gradually increase their rate of employment to that of younger adults, it would boost employment growth and GDP growth by about 0.5%. And by 2050, the economy would be nearly 15% larger. GDP would be 50% higher than it otherwise would be. So there are very substantial economic benefits to longer work lives. There are also fiscal benefits. It's true that longer work lives wouldn't necessarily mean substantial savings or even any savings in Social Security benefits. Once you reach the full benefit retirement age, there's no earnings test. You can collect benefits without any penalty while continuing to work. And if you decide not to collect benefits and if you defer collecting benefits, then you're compensated through a delayed retirement credit. But there would certainly be substantial fiscal savings on the tax side. More employment means higher FICA tax revenue. More employment means higher income tax revenue. Finally, there are individual benefits. Longer work lives make retirement, which is increasingly difficult to finance, more affordable. Most Americans have defined contribution pensions. In a defined contribution system, all other things being equal, working an extra 5 years and collecting benefits for 4 or 5 fewer years increases your potential monthly or yearly draw on that system by about 25%. That's huge. Moreover, most gerontologists agree that continued productive engagement is good for the health of the elderly themselves. There's a substantial and growing literature which suggests that continuing to work has a significant positive effect on the physical health, cognitive function, and emotional well-being of the elderly. So the good news is that America has already made a very significant start at extending work lives. Back in the early post-war years, as Social Security was being liberalized, as employer pensions were becoming much more common, 46% of elderly men worked. By 1990, that had fallen to 16%. The share plateaued during the 90s, but since 2000 has been rising and is now back up to 25%. Meanwhile, the share of women age 65 and older who are employed has risen from 9 to 16%. There are a variety of reasons for the shift, for the turnaround in the elderly employment rate. One of them, of course, has to do with the economy and financial need, and certainly, especially post-Great Recession, that has been a driver. But the turnaround antedates that, which suggests that it's rooted in deeper trends. And these include structural shifts in the economy, from manufacturing to services to the kinds of jobs where physical stamina is less important. Shifts in the structure of the workplace, well, like the kind of Zoom conference we're doing today. Better health at older ages, rising educational attainment among older adults. And I think maybe even most fundamentally, though difficult to quantify, just a generational reassessment of the pros and cons of all or nothing retirement, of flipping a switch versus continued productive engagement. America is actually pretty well positioned to build on this momentum. A lot of other developed countries have rigid lockstep seniority pay scales that make it very difficult for employers to justify retaining older workers. They also have employment rules that make it very difficult to fire underperforming workers. So it discourages employers from hiring them to begin with. There's more that could be done on the employment front in terms of increasing opportunities for phased retirement, family leave policies, lifelong learning. Many of the policies which encourage longer work lives would also benefit younger workers as well. On the government policy front, and here I'm just going to be very brief because Jean and Jason will have a lot to say about this. But there are some constructive steps that government could take. One big obstacle to elderly employment is the fact that for most employees 65 and over, Medicare is the secondary payer. So carrying older workers on employer insurance policies is very expensive, and that's a significant disincentive to hiring them or retaining them. On the Social Security front, we'll be discussing later whether we should be raising the Social Security retirement age. The point I want to make here is that there are some relatively minor tweaks which could have a big potential benefit in terms of encouraging longer work lives that wouldn't necessarily involve raising the retirement age. The way the Social Security benefit formula is currently structured, there really is no extra reward for having a long career. The benefit formula could be changed to reward longer work lives. And on the tax side, once you get to age 70, you're earning nothing in terms of additional benefits, but you're still paying full FICA taxes. Certain economists have discussed reducing FICA taxes at older ages, or even granting older workers past a certain age a fully paid up status and exempting them from FICA taxes altogether. Obviously, that would entail a FICA revenue loss, but the gain in income tax revenue from extra employment would likely offset that. So just to wrap up, I think there are two big possible objections or concerns to longer work lives. One is that more jobs for older people will mean fewer jobs for younger people. Most economists agree, the great majority of economists agree, that this is simply not true. It's a fallacy, and they even have a name for the fallacy. It's called the lump of labor fallacy. The fallacy is that there are a fixed number of jobs in the economy, so there's competition between age groups for them. But that isn't the way it works. The more jobs there are, the more income is earned, the more demand that generates for goods and services, the more jobs are created to meet that demand. And in fact, if you look across the developed world, countries that have higher rates of elderly employment tend to have higher rates of youth employment as well. The other objection and concern is that working longer would be a significant hardship for many Americans, and that's absolutely true. There are large differentials in life expectancy and in health expectancy by socioeconomic status and also by race, and whatever policy changes are enacted need to take these into account, and I think that's something we're going to be talking about as well during the discussion. So just to wrap up, we're not arguing. The Global Aging Institute isn't arguing. I don't think Concord is arguing that everybody should work forever. We're not even arguing that everybody should work longer. But perhaps policy should focus a little less on trying to, solve mission impossible, which is how in an aging society we can spend a growing share of our lives in retirement, and a little more on how to keep people productively engaged at older ages. So that's my introduction, and thanks, Tori.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. Before we move on to Jean, I'd like to we've got another poll. Tyler, can we put that up there? Do you plan to retire later than you thought you would a few years ago? So the poll will be up there for about a minute. So record your answers now and see if we got anything going. I think I'm going to answer this one. So, okay, well, so at this point, we'll get back to the poll a little bit later and see those results. At this point, I'd like to hand the floor over to Gene Sterling for his comments.
Thank you, Tori. And it's an honor to be here. For those in the audience who don't know Richard, he really is one of the world's experts on what's happening with the aging of population, not just in the United States, but around the world. And Jason is among the most creative writers I know in this field. So I really encourage you to look up other of their writings as well. And it's an honor to be with them. I'd like to add more to Richard's comments than necessarily to disagree with them. Two issues basically drive the question on aging. Whoops, I'm going to stop a second, let Tori look at the poll here.
Always helps if I unmute myself. Do you plan to retire later than you thought? 48% say no. So it sounds like people are pretty prepared. I will say that, yes, I plan to retire later than I thought I would a few years ago. So yeah, very interesting. Yes, for financial reasons. Yes, for health insurance reasons. Yes, I like my job. Yay to the people who like their job. Yes, to stay engaged. That was primarily my answer as well, just to stay engaged. So, all right. Thank you. Jean?
That's a good question for some things I want to talk about. But
Mhm.
the first thing I want to mention is that there are two forces that as grown-ups, we just have to deal with as a society. And that is when some things change, they force other behavioral adjustments. And the two things in the aging of the population that need to be distinguished because they have very different effects are fertility changes and mortality changes. The mortality changes are the fact that we're living longer. So relative to 1940 or so, when Social Security first paid benefits, we live about 6-7 years longer on average. And despite the fact that there's been an uptick in employment, we retire for many more years. If you take into account everything, we retire on average about 13 more years than we did in 1940. That is, workers typically retired about or claim benefits at about age 68. Today, they claim them about 64. At age 68 in those years, people had about a 13-year life expectancy. If you look for when people have a 13-year life expectancy now, it's something like about age 77. So we've really made major changes over time, not adjusting to the fact that we're just living a lot longer. And in fact, in one article I wrote, I not entirely facetiously indicated that maybe we needed to redefine our old age and survivors insurance as old age, middle age, and survivors insurance. So clearly at some point, the fact that we're living longer, which is largely a reflection of better health in almost all studies, has some implications for how we should adjust as a society. So if the purpose of an old age program is to help those who are old because they're less likely to be healthier to help take care of themselves, then perhaps that's where we should be putting our resources. The other factor that we have to adjust to is fertility. We may not like the fact that fertility's gone down. We may like it, but it doesn't really matter. The decline in the fertility does mean that the population is getting older. It does mean that there's a larger share of the population, however you define it, in the last 5 years of their life, or a larger share that will be in the last third of their life, particularly as that decline in fertility works its way through the system. And much of what's going on now in the US has to do with the fact that the baby boomers started hitting age 62 around the year 2008 or so. That is, you go from 1946 at 62 years, you're at 2008. And we're in the midst of this baby boom retirement, which is continuing until about the mid-2030s. That also forces us to make adjustments, whether we like it or not. The fact that we are aging in that respect means that somebody has to pay for it. We could say, well, we'll put all the burden on the young, or we could say, well, maybe the old have to share in some of that burden. Or as Richard's trying to say, well, maybe we don't just have to cut, if the old are going to share in this burden, maybe we don't just have to cut benefits, annual benefits, or increase taxes. We could also just try to work a little bit longer and try to ameliorate that type of situation. In fact, I often sometimes facetiously do say, suppose the birth rate falls to 0, and 65 years from now, everybody's over age 65. Will older people need to work longer? Well, yes, they will. They'd be the only people left around. Well, the birth rate fell enough. It fell from 3 for every woman, or 3 for every couple, to 2. So it fell by about 1/3, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have to make further adjustments there. On the positive side, to reinforce what Richard has said, and I've argued this many times, is a lot of economic studies talk about the supply of workers, that is what you and I do, and how we adjust to factors such as Social Security rules, or what changes with defined benefit pension plans, or other things like that. The simple fact is the number of young workers decline and the number of older people increases. The demand for older workers is increasing. And part of that uptick you see in Richard's chart on the labor force supply of older workers, which has been very recent, has exactly to do with that. There's just an increased demand for these workers, and we need to basically create a system that accommodates that increased demand through a lot of different adjustments, such as ones that we'll discuss later. I'd like to also just quickly go, and then because I don't want to take too much more time here, I want to get to Jason, to one of the main reasons why I really care about this issue and care deeply. And that is what is happening to the non-elderly in the budget. So I do a lot of work on the share of the budget and where it's going. So I'll just give you two statistics. One from President Trump's last budget before the COVID-19 crisis, and one from President Obama's last budget. And look out 10 years in that budget where the spending would go. If you look at President Trump's last budget, all of the growth in revenues or all the growth in spending, in real spending, would go for Social Security and Medicare and interest on the debt. Nothing else in aggregate gets anything. So when you hear working families complaining that they're being forgotten by government, I think the budget statistics say, in fact, they're right. If you look at President Obama's last budget that he proposed, it wasn't 100% to Social Security and Medicare, but it was 90% to Social Security and healthcare. The main difference between the two presidents being President Obama's support for other healthcare beyond Medicare, which is healthcare for the non-elderly through exchanges and Medicaid areas where President Trump would cut back. But still, at the end of the day, there's very little left for most working families. And so it seems to me that, as I said, we have to be grown-ups. These changes in fertility and mortality require some adjustment. And I think working longer, the issue that Richard and the Concord Coalition has so aptly raised, are issues that we just have to address and give substantial attention to. Thank you, Tori.
Sure, thanks, Jean. You raised some really good points there. Jason, I'm going to pass the mic to you, sir.
Great, thanks, Tori. And again, thank you for having me here today, and thanks to Richard and to Jean as well. And for that nice introduction, Jean, I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here also. One of the things about going sort of last on a discussant panel is the two people who go before you have probably said everything that's worth saying, and I'm sort of like the third wheel. So let me sort of add some context, because I agree with what Richard and Jean are saying and want to sort of further elaborate on some things. I think it is very important that we discuss and have policies that encourage longer working lives. But keep in mind, what we're trying to do is to encourage working lives to go longer. We're not trying to mandate that they go longer. And that's a difference, because there are some people who want to work, and there are some people who need to work. And we have to keep in mind that there is a distinction. For those that sort of have financial difficulties and need to work, it may not be as easy for them to stay in the workforce. We need to make sure those social protections are there for them. And we can have a discussion about what that means when it comes to raising the retirement age. But we also need to make sure that for those who want to work, we don't have policies in place that discourage them from working. And Jean and Richard both pointed out that sort of the nature of retirement has changed. We're living longer than we used to. When some of our social insurance programs were first created, most people, if they got to age 65, didn't live much longer on the program. Maybe they lived for 10 years to 75 or 72, less than 10 years. Now, as Richard pointed out, we have more people living into age 90. Some are going to live to 100. And at some point, we're going to have looks like Japan, where a lot more people are living to 100. And our system, our social insurance system, was not designed to have basically 40 years of work contributions, fund 30 years of retirement. And so we need to figure out what that means and how we redesign this. And Richard had mentioned some policy options as well. The idea that maybe once you hit a certain age and you have paid up status, maybe you've paid into the system for 40 or 45 years, that we no longer require you to contribute payroll taxes for Social Security and your employer either. That makes it more of an after-tax return to working for you and less costly for your employer if you're elderly to keep you employed. And that encourages work for older years. And I think it's important to think about how we do that. The other thing is we have to change sort of our culture. Again, I still remember my parents and my grandparents who kept talking about retiring at 65. There's something about age 65 in our culture. You retire from your job, you get a gold watch, you file for Social Security, and you live your golden years. That's not what a lot of people are doing these days. A lot of people want to continue working. We also need to sort of disassociate age 65 retirement. Retirement means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Some people stop working altogether. Some people continue working. I know I have a friend who's attending as an attendee for this panel discussion right now, who emailed me earlier this week and said he's now starting his 61st year of working as an actuary. That's not that he's 61 years old. He's starting his 61st year of work. He likes working. He enjoys it. He wants to make sure we can find ways to encourage people who want to stay attached to the labor force to stay attached. And we need to think about what those policies do. And there are some things we can do that I think are low cost that can have high benefits. For example, right now with Social Security, Richard mentioned the idea that we don't really have a lot of benefits for people who work after age 70. In fact, we penalize them because of the payroll tax. One of the things we could do is allow for a greater delayed retirement credits for those who work past 70. Basically allow people to buy an additional annuity from Social Security by continuing to work and delaying claiming past age 70. Give them more of an annuity bump. That would be a helpful policy alternative. And again, since Social Security's actuarial fair, it shouldn't affect the trust funds by doing that. The other is changing the nomenclature. We talk about the full retirement age. What does that mean to have a full retirement age? Is it 65, 66, 67, 66 now in 8 months? We have the early eligibility age. You can get Social Security retirement benefits as early as 62. But when we say early eligibility, people think of it as if you're lining up to get early access to a movie theater, or early access to a club, early access to a sporting event. We don't talk about that. There's actually a penalty in some ways of having a reduced monthly benefit that lasts for the rest of your life. So we should sort of change the nomenclature, which is easy to do, and start talking about minimum benefit age and maximum benefit age. And then allowing people to talk about what does that mean to have something in between and what that benefit level is. Just changing the nomenclature alone could change in some ways the incentives because of the framing for delayed claiming and for people wanting to stay in the workforce. The other is just recognizing to people that just because you decide to stop work does not mean you have to claim Social Security benefits. You can stop working at 62 and claim benefits up to age 70. You also can claim benefits early and continue working. They're mutually exclusive decisions, but we actually lump them together. And that's a different conversation we have to have when we start thinking about the idea of working longer. And additionally, and some people have pointed this out, I'm sure they will in the Q&A, not everyone can work longer. Some people don't have the ability to work from their home during a pandemic in an air-conditioned house. They have greater labor needs and more labor-demanding jobs. We need to think about what that means for those people as well when we talk about longer working lives, and to make sure our policies support them as well. And that could be a stronger minimum benefit for those who have to stop working early and stop working at age 62, for example. But again, these need to be done in concert. Think about how you protect those who need to stop working early, and how you can encourage and support those who want to continue or have to continue working later in life as they get into their late 60s and early 70s and maybe even beyond. And so it's important to think about those policy aspects that we could do, how we can encourage savings. I think another thing to just talk about, which is a little bit different from the working age, but it's still important about savings, is we do a lot of discussion about retirement savings and encouraging people to save for retirement. Save, save, save. Save 5% of your income, save 10% of your income. Our policies are designed to allow your employers to match. Once you get to retirement age, whatever that is for somebody, we then just say, congratulations, you're retired. We don't help them talk about the decumulation phase of what they do with that nest egg they've saved up. And we don't talk about the idea of a consumption frame, which says how much money do you need to have monthly in income to support the consumption you're going to have now for what could be 20 or 30 years in retirement. So we need to do a better job talking about what that means and think about guaranteed lifetime income options for people, because now we've moved from a defined benefit plan society to a defined contribution plan society, where the risk is being put more and more on the worker. And those are the policies we should also consider when thinking about how to encourage longer working lives. And again, I'll wrap up so we have time for Q&A. But again, the point here is we want to encourage people to work longer, not mandate it, but make sure we also change the policies in place that are definitely discouraging people from working longer or penalizing them from doing so. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate that. Before we move into Q&A, I want to put up our third poll of the day. Suppose you retire at age 65, how many years of retirement benefits do you think you will need? So go ahead and I'm not going to answer that one because Jean told me the answer before we started this panel. So I don't want to skew the results. I'll keep my answer out of there. So while you guys are filling out responding to the poll, let me throw a question out there. I know there's been a lot of commentary today about how we are not mandating an increase in the retirement age. We are trying to suggest to people that those who can work longer do so. But I'll just put the question out there because I know there are a lot of questions in the chat function about raising the retirement age. So let me just say, is it appropriate to ask today's older Americans to work longer? And if so, what policy accommodations should be adopted to account for what we now know are disparities in health and in longevity that exist among racial groups and income classes in our nation? So I'll throw that out to our panel. If somebody wants to jump in, I'm going to say jump ball.
Let's go over your poll first.
Okay, our poll question. I suppose you retire. How many years of retirement benefits do you think you'll need? 21 to 25. followed closely by 26 to 30, followed closely by 31 to 35. So, Gene, you want to illuminate us with the answer?
This is a smart audience. For a typical couple, if they retire at 65, they'll need about 27, 28 years. If they're healthy, they'll need over 30. So we didn't say in the question whether we're talking about couples or individuals. For an individual, it's probably closer to the 21 to 25, probably for this group, maybe about 20 years on average for an individual. But the longer living of couples is close to 27 or 28. So
yeah,
pretty informed audience, pretty informed audience.
Yeah, informed audience, but still I was shocked when you told me that before we started this morning. So
Richard alluded to this when he talked about retiring for having to support like a 30-year retirement. His talk as well. So maybe he led us to the right answer.
Very good.
But as long as I got the floor, let me respond to this issue. I object actually to the notion that increasing the retirement age is necessarily making people work longer. What we have in place in our system now, as I say, because we haven't adjusted the retirement age, except for the fact that we created an early retirement age in the early 60s, dropping it from 65 to 62, is a system that every year provides people more and more years of retirement benefits in lieu of doing other things, in lieu of giving them more long-term care when they're old, in lieu of more support in their more senior years, in lieu of improving our disability insurance system. So the failure to adjust the retirement age is really not necessarily mandating an increase in work. It's actually offering more and more years of retirement support over time. And we have to ask ourselves whether that is a priority in the way we spend money relative to the other ways we spend it. The age 62, 65, 66 are pretty arbitrary. And I know we're going to get some further discussion on things like disability. To me, the issue is how do we support all those people who have difficulty work or getting another job? And that starts almost at every age. It becomes very intense for a lot of people if they lose a job in their mid 50s. And so 62 there's no magic about 62 at all. I'd much rather see us strengthen our work supports at older ages, not defined around 62. And personally, I would try to figure out some ways to remove the work test in disability insurance, because the main test of whether people qualify for disability often is just whether they have earnings or not. If they don't have earnings, often they're much more likely to qualify, and as soon as they have earnings, they don't. And that's where I would like to put the work in place, as opposed to failing to adjust for retirement, because every person sitting in this room, and I'm guessing most of our audience, because they now get about 6 or 7 more years of benefits on average, get several $100,000 more in Social Security and Medicare benefits over a lifetime. And I don't necessarily think that should have been the priority for this nation in terms of its needs relative to other things we might have done.
Richard, Jason, do either of you have any comments on what Gene said?
So I'll add quickly, and then give Richard the last word on this. I think Gene's right, and we should be very nuanced in how we discuss this. We should at some point probably start indexing the retirement age for longevity. But the problem with that is realizing, you mentioned this, Tori, and sort of asking the question, that not all income groups, not all racial groups are benefiting equally from changes in longevity. And that sort of creates this sort of idea of fairness. And Gene's getting to that as well, and he wants to put more work supports in, and I totally agree with that. And I think that's the nuance part of the discussion we should have. And part of the first step in thinking about how to do this, because every time you start talking about raising the retirement age, some groups go out there and say, oh, Jason wants to cut Social Security benefits by raising the retirement age. Realize that for those who, if we raise the retirement age to 70, you've now gotten rid of the delayed retirement credits, and you also changed the reduction factors so that those at age 62 would now get a lower monthly benefit. And assuming they don't have any increase in their longevity based on their income status or race, then they are being penalized. So I think it's important to think about how we do this in a nuanced way. And part of what I think would be at least a good way to start, again, is to sort of allow for more delayed retirement credits past age 70. So that for those who want to work and can work, they get the benefits of delaying claiming through a higher annuity value. But we don't necessarily penalize those that have to retire at age 62. And I'm with Gene, though. I want to have a better discussion about what we do for work supports for those who are disabled, and especially when you get to disability issues and say 55 to age 62, how we can better help them stay attached to the labor force.
Okay.
Yeah, let me let me even up the ante and broaden the point that I think Gene was driving at, and maybe you're driving at too, Jason. And that's, should age alone be a criterion for access to public benefits? These arbitrary thresholds of 62, 65, 66 may decades ago have been a reasonable proxy, right, for inability to work, for financial need, but they no longer are. And it would be possible if we could start from scratch to construct a system that offered much greater protection to those who really need it.
Oh, Richard?
Excuse me, I just had a technical a technical issue here. That offers much greater. Don't balance your iPad on a stack of books. Okay. Much greater protection for those who actually need it, whether it's workers in their 50s or early mid 60s who really can't work longer, or whether it's the truly aged who are most likely to have diminished financial resources, to be in need of long-term care, et cetera. That's a discussion I think we should have as a society. It was a little bit beyond the scope of my paper, but I think we're all more or less on the same page here. I'll hold my breath.
Just a quick footnote.
Yeah.
Can I just add a quick footnote here? We've studied what happens if you increase the retirement ages, say the full retirement age. It ends up that the groups that benefit most are the rich. That is, it's basically a proportional system. It proportionally affects groups. The reason for this is that, yes, there's a mortality effect among younger groups, but the groups that have lower income are much more likely to be on disability insurance. And if you're on disability insurance, you don't lose benefits when you increase the retirement age. As a result, the big winners would be the people who are the higher income. So if you're entitled to $400,000 of lifetime benefits, and and the increase would be say 5%, you get 20,000. If you're entitled to 200,000, your increase would only be 10,000. Imagine if we took higher education and we said, let's create a benefit structure that's going to give benefits proportional to your income, so that we're going to give the biggest grants for going to college to the richest people and the smallest grants to the poorest people. That's what not failure to adjust the retirement age does. It does not affect the disadvantaged groups more. It actually affects the advantaged groups the most.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I want to hone in on two things that we've already touched on a little bit. And this was a common question, both in the live chat session right now, but also in questions that were submitted before the program began. There are two significant barriers to working longer: age bias in the workforce, as well as the physical limitations of an aging worker. We've talked a little bit about disability reform. So I wanted to ask our panelists, is there anything more you'd like to say about disability reform? And do you have any ideas for confronting, is there a role for public policy, for example, in confronting age bias in the workforce?
Well, let me defer to Gene and Jason.
Mm-hmm.
And
so,
then,
all right, yeah. I'll start on the second question part of that first, which is what can we do on disability insurance? And I've done some research on this, and sort of the concern that I have and some of my co-authors I've worked with is that for the Social Security disability insurance system, generally speaking, it's binary. It's all or nothing. You're either disabled or you are not. You can work or you can't. And that is not reflecting the dynamic nature of reality of disability. There are many people out there who would like to work and could work, for example, say 20 hours a week, but with a physical disability or limiting disability cannot work 40 hours a week. And if you try to apply for SSDI, basically the idea is, well, if you can work 20 hours, you don't qualify. We need to do more on the work support side, and Gene mentioned this as well. But one of the policies we could do is change SSDI from being all or nothing to being a partial or temporary system. Once you're on DI, there's like a 2% chance you go back to work, maybe less than that. And that's not the nature of our workforce. So we need to do more of looking about how we can reform and modernize both our Social Security retirement system and our Social Security disability insurance system to reflect the reality of people's working lives. And again, that could be, some people are temporarily disabled. They might have issues that require them to leave the workforce for 6, 12 months, but then want to go back, but their skills have atrophied. What can we do with a partial DI system that allows that, or a temporary system that allows them to come on, get health care, get disability, but once they're ready to go back to work, we help them go back to work and they don't lose their health care. So we need to be more inclusive and more dynamic and broadening and thinking about what disability means and how that relates to the workforce. And then to encourage longer working lives, a partial and temporary DI system could do that. Again, there's a lot more to talk about with this, and there's a lot of nuance in it, but we have to think more creatively than just binary, you're disabled or you're not. That's not going to be helpful for helping people work longer lives.
Okay.
So the age bias question is a really tough one because there's actually age biases both ways. The elderly, in some cases, are favored over younger workers. By the way, you can discriminate against the young. That's totally legal in our system. You supposedly cannot discriminate against the old. But things like have already been mentioned, requiring Medicare to be a secondary payer is actually forcing a very heavy tax either on the employer or the employee for carrying an older worker relative to the cost of providing health insurance for a younger worker. So I think working on things like Medicare as a secondary payer, and I'm even thinking of things like exchange types of subsidies, and Obamacare is available for people below age 62 or below 65 as factors we might put in place that I think would mitigate what we sometimes call age bias against the elderly, but sometimes it's just a rational reaction to the fact that some elderly people get paid more than younger people for doing the same work. And then there's a strong incentive for employers to either not hire them or to encourage them to retire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure I really have much substantive to add to that other than to reiterate Gene's point that we do have age discrimination laws in place, which in fact most developed countries don't. Maybe what's required is the same kind of cultural shift we've seen, related to gender in the workplace or sexual orientation. I think if we remove these obstacles and disincentives to work at older ages, and as Gene pointed out earlier, we do have a rising demand for older workers. We just need to rejigger the incentives and remove the obstacles.
Mm-hmm. So this was a good question that came to us in the chat function. The United States is sort of one of the last developed economies to go through this aging cycle. So we've had the benefit to look at other nations and what they've done. And a lot of people like to mention Japan. Richard, directly to you, because I know that you've studied a lot of retirement systems in other countries. Are there things that we can learn from other countries who have preceded us into this sort of aging of our workforce, learn from their experiences and bring those experiences to bear here in the United States in terms of public policy? Is there anything that you see that that's really working that we should consider here?
Well, it's really an interesting question because I would say that encouraging longer work lives is one of the few areas in aging policy where we probably have more to teach other countries than to learn from them. If we were doing a session on how to adjust government social security systems for the demographic realities of an aging society, we'd be talking about Sweden. Japan is an exception. Japan has a very high elderly labor force participation rate, but it always has. It hasn't been rising, and one of the reasons it's higher is that although Japan has a seniority pay system, that gets cut off, I believe, at age 60, certainly in the early 60s. You actually retire from your career job and are often rehired by your employer in a different position, often with less responsibility and at lower pay. And that's one of the things that keeps the elderly labor force participation high in Japan. I'm not sure that's a lesson we want to import. What's happening in Europe is that many countries which had bought into this lump of labor fallacy back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, that the way to solve youth unemployment was to bribe older people to retire, with very generous, heavily subsidized early retirement benefits have learned their lesson, repealed those programs, changed the incentives, and they're seeing rapidly rising labor force participation rates now. But actually, and I'll just wrap it up by making reiterating the point that, you know, in terms of flexible retirement, phased retirement, age discrimination protections, et cetera, this is an area where other countries, you know, perhaps could learn from us.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question that came through the chat a little while ago. It's sort of a direct challenge to the lump of labor fallacy. It says, if it is indeed a fallacy, why are we seeing data that indicate college graduates are unable to find good paying jobs with benefits, while at the same time, older people are staying in the workforce? So it seems to directly challenge this idea that it's not a zero-sum game, that the labor force isn't a zero-sum game. Can we address that?
Well, let me first clarify, and then I'll make a necessary clarification, and then turn it over to Jean and Jason and see what they have to add. First of all, it is entirely possible that there is competition between age groups for jobs at the firm level, right? If the senior professor won't retire, the associate professor isn't going to get that job, and so forth. So you could have competition at the firm level. You could even have competition at the sectoral level. Presumably, the point economists make is that at the economy-wide level, you shouldn't. And in general, we don't see that. The only quick off-the-cuff thought I have on that is that there may be adjustment issues and it can take time to clear. Let my two distinguished colleagues jump in here and square the circle for me.
So I just have two quick comments. One is we have a much more educated workforce today than we did, say, 30 years ago. So the education level of older workers is about equivalent now to that of younger workers, at least say in terms of share of the population that retired from college. Whereas in the past, the younger populations were coming in as a much more educated population, and therefore were more easily able to displace older workers. But there's certain ways in which what we're talking about in terms of discrimination in old age, working in different ways, can actually, both answers can be right about how we're encouraging older workers to retire and we're discriminating against younger workers. And that's a case of some studies we've been doing on state and local pension plans, which are still basically defined benefit pension plans that provide an annual benefit rather than typically a lump sum of money in a 401k or what the equivalent. And what we've discovered there is that in the reforms of the state pension plans, what both states have done is basically protect the older workers. There's typically a second generation of workers who's not quite as well protected, which is sort of people in their 40s to 50s to 60s who stay on an old plan, and the younger workers are coming in the new plan. And what we've discovered is that with this actuarial imbalance, all these systems almost in every state are way out of balance. The amount of promised benefits just for the existing employees is way in excess of the amount of funds that they have on hand. And so one of the ways that they've solved this is for these young workers, they're converting them quickly to a much less generous plan, and they're very much upping their employee contribution. According to our calculations at the Urban Institute, we're finding that the vast majority of young workers in these plans are getting negative benefits from their employers. That is, the value of what they're going to get out of the plan will be less than the value of their own contributions, and that the states are using that money to partly fund the more generous retirement for older workers. Now, for older workers, they often get to a point in these defined benefit plans where if they work another year, their benefits don't go up at all. So they're encouraged to retire. So here's a perfect example. You can have an encouragement of older workers to retire, an incentive that ideally should not have been there, and a disincentive for younger workers where we're basically not even giving them equal pay for equal work.
sorry, still muted. There was one of my questions. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege here. The last decade has been bookended by two significant recessions between the Great Recession in 2008 and now the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of our older workers have found themselves involuntarily separated from the workforce, which, if they start collecting Social Security as a consequence, has led to early retirements and permanently reduced benefit levels. I'm wondering, given the fact that we were discussing before this panel discussion started about the failure of economics and how inability to control the business cycle, are there counter-cyclical policies that can help in this instance, as long as we're trying to encourage people to work longer lives? Are there existing policies that may not be well known? I'm thinking in particular of the ability to begin to collect Social Security, but then pause that benefit. Are there new policies that we should be considering? Or are there certain policies that exist that should be expanded to sort of address this situation where it's, for example, age 54, 55, 56, you find yourself involuntarily separated from the workforce?
So I'll go first, since I was the first one to unmute my microphone. I know we're short on time, so I'll keep this short to give my colleagues a chance to answer as well. For those who have been bookended by the Great Recession and now the pandemic-reduced recession, I think that goes to sort of Richard's main point, is how do we encourage now longer work lives? Because this generation is going to have to work longer to make up for some lost time that they didn't have. And the good news for them is they're the most educated generation in history. They are going to be able to work longer because they're going to benefit both from their education they have and from the healthcare that allows them to have increases in longevity. So they can work longer on average than on previous generations. But we're going to have to encourage and help them do that. And we need to think about the savings incentives to do that, as well as the labor force incentives to help them stay attached to labor force longer, so they make up that savings so they can have a secure retirement.
I was also wondering if there were any comments on continuing education or job retraining or anything along those lines.
Well, just on the previous point, Tori, I would simply say that while older workers have been hurt by these two bookend recessions, the Great Recession and the pandemic, the generation that's really going to suffer most from this are millennials. Anyway, let me hand it over to Gene. I think had something to say.
The great Robert Samuelson, who's a columnist for many different papers, including the Washington Post, recently wrote his farewell column, I guess today, and he criticized economists for often trying to only say good things, are often acting like politicians in the sense of always sort of supporting what politicians want to hear, which I call operating on the giveaway side of the budget. But I think if we had been more willing to do things in terms of getting the expenses of old age and other retirement systems in order, as well as healthcare, particularly where it's basically largely price increases that are going to providers that we didn't control, we could have spent a lot more providing subsidies for workers in general. I don't know whether the solution there is just to provide subsidies or help for workers who just in old age, as opposed to across the board. But I think we could have done a lot more to provide work incentives that I think both would have helped people during this recession at all ages, but also encourage more work.
Great. Well, I'm noticing the time. It is 11 o'clock on the dot. It is the witching hour. I want to thank our panelists, Richard, Jean, Jason. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been a lot of fun for me. It's also been very educational. I'd like to thank our viewers today. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. And thanks so much, and have a great day.